The air at the Henderson farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel exhaust, dust, and the bittersweet smell of a life's work being sold off piece by piece. It was the summer of 1973, and Jedediah Stone moved through the crowd with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew the value of patience. He wasn't here for the big-ticket items. His eyes scanned past the late-model tractors and shiny implements, searching for the humble treasures hidden in the long grass. A stack of old sickle bars, a 5-gallon bucket of assorted bolts, maybe a decent chain hoist. His farm, the one his father had carved out of the Iowa soil with a team of mules and a single-bottom plow, was paid for. Every nail in the barn, every fence post, every acre of black dirt was his, free and clear. He aimed to keep it that way. A sudden hush fell over the crowd, followed by a low rumble that grew into a throaty growl. Heads turned as a brand-new John Deere 7700 combine, its green paint so bright it hurt the eyes, eased its way down the lane. At the wheel, perched high in the air-conditioned cab, was Richard Miller. He killed the big diesel engine, the sudden silence making its presence even more profound. Miller, who everyone was already calling Rich, hopped down, his new cowboy boots barely getting dusty. He'd bought the old Henderson place next door to his own expanding operation, and bringing his new machine here was nothing short of a victory lap. "Morning, folks," Rich said, his voice carrying an easy confidence that grated on Jed's nerves. "Just thought I'd bring the new girl out for a spin. Figure old man Henderson would have liked to see what a real combine looks like on his land." A few of the younger farmers chuckled and gathered around, running their hands over the massive grain head and peering at the clean engine compartment. Jed stayed back, leaning against the rusty fender of a Farmall M, his arms crossed over his chest. He knew what this was about. It was about making a statement. It was about showing everyone that Rich Miller was the future, and men like Jed were the past. Rich spotted him. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He sauntered over, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. "Jed, didn't figure I'd see you here. I thought you only bought parts that were made before the war." The men nearby snickered. Jed just nodded. "Rich, impressive machine." "She's the best money can buy," Rich boasted, slapping a massive rear tire. 6-row corn head, hydrostatic drive, grain tank big enough to swim in. Got her financed through the PCA. The banker said a man's got to spend money to make money. Said I'd be a fool not to upgrade with corn prices heading for the moon. He paused, looking Jed up and down, taking in his worn work shirt and faded jeans. "You still running that old Massey?" Jed's jaw tightened. He knew his combine was a joke to most of them. It was a 1957 Massey Harris 90 Special, a hulking, awkward-looking machine with a simple canvas draper head and an open operator's platform. His father had bought it used in '61, and it had brought in every crop on the Stone farm since. It was loud, it was dusty, and it was slow. But it was his. "She still cuts grain," Jed said, his voice low and even. Rich laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound. "Cuts grain? Jed, that thing belongs in a museum, not a cornfield. How can you possibly get your crops out in time with that relic? The boys at the co-op were taking bets on how many times she'll break down on you this year. That combine is too old, Jed. It's holding you back." Jed felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. He'd heard it all before. From his brother-in-law, from the parts man at the implement dealer, from nearly everyone. They saw his weathered, paid-for equipment as a sign of failure, of a lack of ambition. They couldn't understand his deep-seated aversion to debt, a fear branded into him by his father's stories of the Great Depression, of seeing neighbors lose everything they'd worked for because of a single bad year and a note at the bank. "My Massey doesn't have a payment book, Rich," Jed said, meeting his gaze. "When the crop is in the bin, the money is mine, not the bank's." Rich just shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "You can't see the bigger picture, Jed. This is the new age of farming. Go big or go home. Land values are soaring, grain prices are up. A man would be a fool not to leverage himself to the hilt right now. In 5 years, I'll own half this county, and you'll still be tinkering with that rusty old antique, praying for a dry spell." He clapped Jed on the shoulder, a gesture that was more condescending than friendly, and walked back to his gleaming green machine, the center of attention once more. Jed watched him go, the laughter of the other farmers ringing in his ears. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling that the world was moving on and he was being left behind, clinging to principles that nobody seemed to value anymore. He looked from Rich's new John Deere, a symbol of debt-fueled optimism, to the rows of old, discarded machinery waiting for the auctioneer's call. He saw his own reflection in their faded paint and rusted steel. "Now, before we get too deep into this story, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had to make a choice between taking on a big loan for something new and shiny, or sticking with the old reliable that you owned free and clear? Maybe it was a car, a piece of equipment for your business, or even a house. Let me know down in the comments what you chose and how it worked out for you. I'm genuinely curious to hear your stories." Jed turned his back on the auction and walked toward his old Ford pickup. He hadn't found the parts he was looking for, but he'd found something else, a cold, hard resolve. He would prove them all wrong. He and his old Massey, they'd show them what a man could do with his own 2 hands and a farm that was truly his. The first week of October arrived with a crisp, northern wind that rustled the dry corn stalks, making them whisper secrets of the coming harvest. While Rich Miller's 7700 was already rolling, its diesel engine a distant hum on the horizon, Jed's Massey Harris 90 sat silent in the machine shed. For him, the harvest didn't begin in the field. It began here, in the cool, dusty sanctuary of his workshop. He started, as he always did, with the heart of the beast, the 277 cubic inch Continental flathead, 6-cylinder engine. It wasn't a powerhouse like the modern diesels, but it was simple and honest. He pulled the plugs, their tips showing a healthy, light tan color from last year's run. He checked the gaps with a feeler gauge, adjusting them with a light tap, then cleaned the electrodes with a wire brush until they shone. He moved on to the distributor, popping the cap to inspect the points and rotor. He ran a fine grit file between the contacts of the points, cleaning off the slight pitting, then set the gap with the same meticulous care, knowing that a few thousandths of an inch here could mean the difference between a quick start and a flooded, stubborn engine. Next came the lubrication, a ritual as old as the machine itself. The Massey was a creature of grease zerks and oil cups. There were dozens of them, hidden in the complex guts of the machine. He loaded his grease gun with a fresh tube of moly-based grease, the smell of it sharp and familiar. He crawled underneath the combine, his trouble light casting long shadows, and began the slow, methodical process. The main axle bearings, the U-joints on the drive shaft, the pivot points for the variable speed V-belt drive. Each one got a shot of fresh grease until a clean bead pushed the old, gritty stuff out. He climbed up top, hitting the zerks on the straw walkers, the shaker arms, and every bearing on the separator. He filled the oil cups on the slower-moving chains, the thick, honey-colored oil clinging to the metal. The most critical part was the canvas draper on the grain head. Unlike Miller's modern auger head, the Massey used 2 wide canvas belts, one on the floor and one on the back, to carry the cut stalks into the machine. They were the combine's Achilles heel. Jed unrolled each one on the machine shed floor, inspecting every inch of the heavy fabric. He found a small tear near one of the wooden slats and set about repairing it. He got out his curved sailmaker's needle and a spool of heavy, waxed thread. Pushing the thick needle through the tough canvas was hard work, his calloused fingers straining with each stitch. It wasn't a pretty repair, but it was strong. He knew that a single rip in that canvas during harvest could cost him half a day of precious cutting time. He spent the better part of a day just checking and tightening the dozens of belts and chains that drove the machine's various functions. The main separator belt, the fan belt, the chain that drove the unloading auger. Each had to have the perfect tension. Too tight, and you'd burn out a bearing. Too loose, and it would slip under load, plugging the whole machine. He tapped each one with a wrench handle, listening to the tone like a musician tuning an instrument. The scorn from the community was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of his work. His brother-in-law, Frank, stopped by one afternoon, shaking his head as he watched Jed painstakingly replace a worn sickle section on the cutter bar. "Jedediah, for the love of God," Frank said, picking up a rusty wrench. "You spend more time fixing this thing than you do farming. Miller's already got 100 acres of corn out. You're going to be shelling corn at Christmas." "Let him," Jed replied without looking up, his focus on aligning the new section. "His corn isn't going anywhere. Mine isn't either. I'll get to it when the machine is ready. When it's ready, it'll never be ready. It's worn out. The banker told me Miller's already pre-sold his crop at over $3 a bushel. He's going to clear a fortune. You're over here playing mechanic with a junkyard reject." Jed finally stood up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "This junkyard reject doesn't send the bank a bill for $500 every month, Frank. That's $500 that stays right here on this farm." Frank just threw his hands up in exasperation and left. The encounters were always the same. At the feed store, the men would stop talking when he walked in, then ask with feigned politeness if he'd gotten the old girl running yet. He'd see them in the corner of his eye, nudging each other. He once overheard a younger farmer say, "Stone's so tight he squeaks when he walks." His dad was the same way. Never took a chance in his life. The day finally came. The corn had dried down to a perfect 15% moisture. A high-pressure system had settled in, promising a week of clear skies and dry weather. Jed climbed onto the operator's platform of the Massey, his perch exposed to the wind and sun. He pulled the choke, turned the key, and pressed the starter button. The old Continental engine turned over once, twice, then coughed to life in a cloud of blue smoke. It settled into a low, rumbling idle that vibrated through the steel deck plate and up through the soles of his boots. He engaged the separator, and the whole machine came alive with a symphony of clanking chains, whirring belts, and the rhythmic clatter of the sickle bar. It was a deafening roar, a stark contrast to the quiet hiss of Miller's hydrostatic drive. He eased the combine out of the shed and down the lane toward the North 40. The first few passes went smoothly. The old machine chewed through the stalks, the ears of corn popping off as they hit the snapping rolls, the kernels rattling into the small grain tank. It was slow, tedious work. He could only take 2 rows at a time, and his ground speed was barely a walking pace. From the county road, he saw Rich Miller's massive 7700 devouring 6 rows at a time, leaving a wide, clean swath in its wake. Rich gave a long blast of his air horn as he passed, a gesture Jed knew was pure mockery. He ignored it and focused on his work. He learned to read the machine not by gauges, but by sound and feel. He could tell by the pitch of the engine's whine when it was starting to lug down. He could feel a subtle vibration through the steering wheel, that told him a bearing might be running hot. On the third day, that sixth sense paid off. He heard a new sound, a high-pitched squeak, almost a chirp, coming from the rear of the machine. It was faint, easily lost in the general cacophony, but it was there. He immediately shut everything down and climbed off. The silence that followed was almost as loud as the noise had been. He traced the sound to one of the bearings on the straw walker crankshaft. He laid the back of his hand against the bearing housing. It was scorching hot. He'd greased it, but the bearing was failing. If it seized, it would snap the crankshaft, a catastrophic failure that would end his harvest for good. The part was obsolete. He couldn't just drive to town and buy a new one. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat, but he pushed it down. He walked back to the machine shed, his mind racing. He remembered seeing an old piece of equipment half buried in the weeds behind his grandfather's original barn, a derelict New Holland baler from the 40s. He seemed to recall the plunger mechanism used a similar-sized bearing. With a shovel and a pry bar, he dug the old baler out of the earth that had tried to reclaim it. It was a rusty, forgotten hulk. But after an hour of wrestling with seized bolts and caked-on grime, he managed to free the bearing assembly. He carried the heavy, greasy part back to his workshop. He pressed the old bearing out and cleaned it up. It was the same size, the same bolt pattern. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He worked by the light of a single bare bulb hanging from the rafters, the shadows dancing around him. He carefully cleaned the crankshaft, polished it with emery cloth, and pressed the salvaged bearing into place. It was well past midnight when he finally tightened the last bolt. Exhausted, covered in grease from head to toe, he climbed back onto the Massey's platform, turned the key, and engaged the separator. The squeak was gone. He stood there for a long moment in the cool night air, listening to the steady, healthy rhythm of his machine, the only sound for miles around. He hadn't beaten Rich Miller. He hadn't even finished a single field. But he had survived, and for now, that was enough. The mid-1970s rolled in like a golden tide. The papers were full of it. The Russian grain deal, global shortages, insatiable demand. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for years, suddenly shot past $3, then $3.50. Soybeans were even better. It was a boom time, the likes of which nobody in the county had ever seen. The old-timers shook their heads in disbelief, while the younger generation saw it as the new normal, a permanent plateau of prosperity. For Rich Miller, it was the ultimate vindication. He had leveraged himself at the perfect time. The massive yields from his newly acquired land, combined with the sky-high prices, meant he was swimming in cash. But for a man like Rich, enough was never enough. The windfall wasn't for paying down debt, it was for acquiring more. He used his incredible cash flow as collateral for even larger loans from the Production Credit Association. He bought another 240 acres from a retiring farmer before it even went on the market, paying a price per acre that made Jed's father turn over in his grave. Rich's farm became a showcase of modern agricultural power. A brand new John Deere 4630 tractor with the iconic Sound Guard cab sat next to his 7700 combine. He traded in his old grain trucks for 2 new tandem-axle Chevrolets with high-sided boxes. His biggest investment was a center pivot irrigation system for a sandy quarter section of land that had always been considered marginal. At night, its blinking lights swept across the landscape like a lighthouse, a beacon of progress and prosperity. He became the king of the local coffee shop, holding court every morning. "You gotta be in it to win it," he'd say, slapping the counter for emphasis. "The bank is practically giving money away. They know a good investment when they see one. Land's the only thing they're not making more of. He'd often look over at Jed, who sat quietly in a corner booth, nursing a single cup of coffee. Some fellas are just too scared to play the game. Happy with their little patch, I guess. Can't see the forest for the trees. Jed felt the sting of those words and the knowing glances that followed. He was having good years too, the best of his life, in fact. The high prices meant the modest yields from his 400 acres were bringing in more money than he'd ever dreamed of. But his reaction to the boom was the polar opposite of riches. The first thing he did was pay off the small operating loan he took out each spring for seed and fertilizer. The feeling of walking out of the bank with a piece of paper that said, "Paid in full," was more satisfying to him than a new tractor would ever be. With the leftover profits, he didn't buy more land. He improved what he had. He put up a new 20,000 bushel grain bin, a used butler that he and Frank disassembled, moved, and reassembled themselves over a long summer. He paid cash for it. He bought a slightly used but well-maintained International Harvester Lodestar 1600 single-axle grain truck, allowing him to haul his own grain to the elevator and wait for better prices instead of being forced to sell right out of the field. He paid cash for that too. The rest of the money, a substantial sum, he put away. He didn't trust the stock market. Instead, he bought U.S. savings bonds and opened several certificates of deposit at the First National Bank of Grafton. His conservatism was seen as a profound failure. Even his wife, Mary, gently questioned him. "Jed, the Petersons are putting in a new kitchen. The Hansons are going to Florida for 2 weeks this winter. Rich Miller is buying up the whole county. And you're buying savings bonds? Mary, this can't last," he'd tell her, sitting at the same simple oak table his grandfather had built. "Prices like this have never happened before. What goes up must come down. I'd rather have money in the bank than a new kitchen with a lien on it." He was an island of caution in an ocean of optimism. At the co-op, the manager tried to talk him into booking his fertilizer for the next 2 years on credit. "Lock it in now, Jed. Prices are only going up." Jed politely declined and paid for next spring's supply with a check. He was labeled Scared Money Stone, a man so afraid of losing what he had that he was missing the chance of a lifetime to get more. The quiet respect he once held in the community for being a good, solid farmer was replaced with a kind of pity. He was a relic, as old and out of place as his Massey Harris combine. One cool evening in the late autumn of 1978, Jed was at the bank depositing the final check from his soybean crop. The boom was still on, but there were whispers, faint tremors beneath the surface. The news on the radio talked of inflation, of gas lines in the cities, of an oil crisis. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, a man with graying temples and a perpetually worried expression, initialed Jed's deposit slip. "Another good year, Jedediah," Abernathy said, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can't complain, sir," Jed replied. Abernathy leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I see you're still putting most of it into those CDs. Smart man. Very smart. Just what my father taught me. Don't spend what you don't have." "A lesson some of our other customers would do well to remember," Abernathy murmured, glancing out the window as if he could see all the way to Rich Miller's farm. "The Fed is getting serious about this inflation. Paul Volcker, the new chairman, he's talking about tightening the money supply, talking about raising the prime interest rate drastically." Jed wasn't an economist, but he knew what that meant. "So it'll cost more to borrow money." Abernathy gave a short, mirthless laugh. "That's putting it mildly. It means the variable rate loans a lot of these fellas have, well, the payments could double or triple. a man who's leveraged to the hilt on the assumption that corn will stay at $4 and interest will stay at 7%. He's going to be in for a rude awakening. Jed felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He thought of Rich Miller's empire, the new land, the shiny equipment, the massive irrigation system, all of it built on a foundation of cheap, easy credit. He thought of the sheer scale of the payments Rich must be making. That night, Jed couldn't sleep. He stood on his back porch, looking out over his dark, silent fields. The land was resting, preparing for winter. It asked for nothing but good stewardship. In the distance, across the valley, the lights on Rich Miller's center pivot irrigator blinked rhythmically. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It was a mechanical heartbeat, a symbol of a new kind of farming he didn't understand. It looked so powerful, so permanent. But as he stood there in the quiet darkness, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching a clock, and it was ticking down to midnight. The year 1980 dawned not with a bang, but with a chilling silence from the east. President Carter, his face grim on the small black and white television in Jed's living room, announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The words hung in the air like frost. The Russian grain deal, the very engine of the boom, had been shut off. Overnight, the bottom fell out of the market. Corn prices, which had flirted with $4, plummeted to $2.50, then $2.20, and showed no sign of stopping. At the coffee shop, the confident chatter was replaced by worried whispers. Rich Miller was no longer holding court. He'd sit in a back booth, stirring his coffee endlessly, his eyes fixed on the grain quotes chalked up on the board behind the counter. The lines of stress around his mouth had deepened, and the easy swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, coiled energy. His empire, built on the assumption of ever-rising prices, was suddenly built on quicksand. That summer, nature itself seemed to turn against them. A dome of high pressure settled over the Midwest, and the sky turned a hazy, metallic blue. It didn't rain for a week, then 2, then a month. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, stood stunted and pale green, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, desperately trying to conserve moisture. Rich's expensive center pivot irrigation system, his ace in the hole, became an albatross. The diesel engine that powered its pump ran 24 hours a day, devouring fuel at prices that had doubled due to the oil crisis. Worse, the aquifer it drew from was dropping, and the spray it cast upon the thirsty fields seemed to evaporate before it even hit the ground. Jed's corn suffered too, but his deep, black soil, enriched by years of manure from his father's small cattle herd and careful crop rotation, held the moisture better. His plants were stressed, but they were alive. His costs, as always, were low. He had no irrigation pump to feed, no massive fuel bill from running a fleet of new, thirsty machines. He watched the sky, his face etched with the same worry as every other farmer. But his worry was for his crop, not for the bank. The first real crack in Rich's facade appeared in late August. Jed was in town, picking up a new set of V-belts for his Massey, when he saw the John Deere service truck parked in Rich's driveway. It was there for 3 days. The gossip at the parts counter was that the hydrostatic transmission on the 7700 combine had failed. It was a complex, sealed unit, impossible to repair on the farm. A new one had to be ordered from the factory in Moline. The cost, they whispered, was over $5,000, more than Jed had paid for his entire farm truck. It was a bill Rich, with his collapsed income and soaring interest payments, could not afford. Harvest arrived with a sense of grim duty. The yields were a disaster, down by 1/3 across the county. Rich's irrigated ground did a little better, but not enough to cover the staggering cost of the fuel and the combine repair. He ran his machines with a frantic intensity, trying to squeeze every last bushel out of the parched earth. Jed's harvest was, as always, a slow and steady affair. One afternoon, a vital drive chain on the Massey's grain elevator snapped. The machine groaned to a halt, a sudden, unnerving silence in the middle of the field. A younger farmer might have despaired, but Jed simply sighed, climbed down, and walked back to his workshop. From a coffee can full of assorted hardware, he pulled out a new master link. He trudged back to the field, and within 20 minutes, with a pair of pliers and a hammer, he had the chain back together. The repair cost him less than $1. The image of the John Deere service truck, with its uniformed mechanic and computerized diagnostic tools, flashed in his mind. He shook his head and climbed back onto his seat, the old Continental engine roaring back to life. He was losing the race, but he was finishing it on his own terms. The winter of 1981 was when the whispers turned to shouts. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, raised the prime interest rate to an astronomical 21%. For farmers like Rich Miller, who had signed variable rate loans years ago when the rate was a comfortable 7%, it was a death blow. His operating notes, his land payments, his equipment loans, the interest on everything tripled. The monthly statements from the PCA were no longer bills, they were execution notices. The wave of foreclosures started as a trickle, then became a flood. Every week, the local paper carried another notice of a public auction. These weren't the hopeful retirement sales of the mid-70s. These were funerals. Families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years packed their belongings into U-Hauls, their faces blank with shock and shame. The signs started appearing on fence posts, along the county roads, crudely painted. "Don't let the bankers steal our homes." It was a quiet, desperate rebellion against forces no one could control. Jed survived. His savings, tucked away in certificates of deposit, was suddenly earning incredible interest. The bank that was choking the life out of his neighbors was paying him. It was a bitter irony he never spoke of. He lived simply, as he always had. He bought his seed and fertilizer with cash, his small orders a stark contrast to the massive lines of credit others had once commanded. He watched as the local implement dealership, which had sold millions of dollars worth of shiny green and red machinery on credit, boarded up its windows. The parts he needed for his old Massey were now harder to find, but he had a network of other old-timers and a knack for making one part do the job of another. The day he knew it was truly over for Rich was when he saw him at the co-op, trying to sell a few dozen bags of leftover seed corn. Rich looked like a different man. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The confident swagger had been replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. He had lost weight, and his work clothes, once new and crisp, hung loosely on his frame. He was arguing with the manager, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's good seed, Tom. I just need something for it. Anything." The manager just shook his head sadly, pointing to a new policy, scrawled on a piece of cardboard and taped to the counter. No buybacks, no credit, no exceptions. The notice for the Miller Farm auction appeared in the paper 2 weeks later. It was scheduled for a cold, blustery Saturday in March. The list of equipment was a testament to a dream that had died. The John Deere 7700 combine, the 4630 tractor, the 2 tandem axle grain trucks, the center pivot irrigator to be sold for scrap, and finally 480 acres of prime Iowa farmland, sold in 3 separate parcels. Jed went to the auction. He didn't know why, exactly. It wasn't to gloat. The sight of it all gave him no pleasure, only a profound and heavy sadness. The crowd was huge, but the atmosphere was funereal. Farmers stood in tight, silent groups, their hats pulled low against the wind. They weren't here as bidders. They were here as mourners, watching one of their own be publicly dismantled. They all knew it could have been them. Rich was there, standing beside the auctioneer's truck, looking like a ghost on his own land. His wife was nowhere to be seen. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone, as the auctioneer began to sell off his life, piece by piece. The bidding was sluggish, the prices insultingly low. The brand-new equipment, bought at the peak of the boom, was now selling for pennies on the dollar in a market saturated with distress sales. The 4630 tractor, which had cost Rich nearly $30,000, sold for $8,000. The mighty 7700 combine, his pride and joy, the symbol of his ambition, barely fetched $10,000. Jed watched it all, his hands deep in his pockets, his heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. He saw not an antagonist, but a man who had simply believed the gospel of his time, that the good times would never end, that debt was a tool, that bigger was always better. Rich had played the game by the rules everyone was given, and the rules had changed in the middle of the night. Then the auctioneer moved on to the final piece of equipment, a 6-row John Deere 7000 planter, a good, solid piece of machinery that was the heart of any corn operation. The bidding started at $1,000. It crept to $1,500. It stalled. Jed looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw men who needed that planter, who could use it, but who had no cash and no credit. He looked at Rich, whose face finally broke, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. In that moment, something shifted in Jed. This wasn't about vindication. It was about decency. He raised his hand. $2,000, he said, his voice clear and steady in the cold air. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. A murmur went through the crowd. Everyone turned to look at Jedediah Stone, the man who never spent a dime. The bidding resumed, but Jed was resolute. He counted every bid until the auctioneer finally pointed a finger at him and shouted, "Sold, for $3,200 to Mr. Jedediah Stone." The final act of the tragedy was the sale of the land. The 2 expansion parcels Rich had bought sold quickly to an out-of-state insurance company, the new absentee landlords of the farm crisis era. But when the auctioneer came to the final parcel, the original 160-acre Miller homestead, the piece of ground Rich's grandfather had broken with a team of horses, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was different. This was sacrilege. The bidding was slow, driven by the man from the insurance company. It reached a price that Jed knew was far below its true worth, but far beyond what any local farmer could pay. The auctioneer called for a final bid. Going once, going twice. Jed felt a hand on his arm. It was Mr. Abernathy, the bank president. He had been standing quietly at the back of the crowd. "Jedediah," he whispered, his voice urgent, "the bank will hold the paper on that parcel for a local buyer. We'll offer a fixed rate, a fair one. We don't want that insurance company owning the whole county." Jed looked from the banker to the auctioneer, then to Rich, who stood utterly defeated, watching his birthright about to be sold to a stranger in a suit. He thought of his own father, of the stories of the Depression, of the sacred trust between a man and his land. He thought of his savings bonds and his CDs, money he had saved for a rainy day. He looked at Rich's face, and he knew it was pouring. He raised his hand again. The entire crowd went still. His bid was just $100 over the insurance man's, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. The man in the suit looked over, annoyed, and raised it. Jed countered immediately. They went back and forth, the price climbing in small, tense increments. Finally, the insurance man shook his head and turned away. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his voice hoarse. "To Jedediah Stone." A wave of relief, almost a cheer, went through the crowd of farmers. They swarmed around Jed, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand. They weren't congratulating a man on a purchase. They were thanking a man for defending one of their own. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the last of the equipment was being loaded onto trailers, Jed walked over to where Rich was standing alone by the empty machine shed. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of damp earth and diesel fuel. Rich wouldn't look at him. "Come to enjoy the show, Jed? Come to tell me you told me so?" His voice was a raw whisper. "No," Jed said quietly. "I came to talk about your planter." Rich finally looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "My planter? It's your planter now." "It's a good planter," Jed said. "Too good to sit in my shed. I need someone to run it for me this spring." "On this ground?" He nodded toward the 160 acres of the old Miller homestead. "I'm going to need a tenant. I was thinking I'd rent it out for a share of the crop, a third, with an option for the tenant to buy it back from me when he gets on his feet, for exactly what I paid for it. No interest." Rich stared at him, his mouth agape. He couldn't comprehend it. He searched Jed's face for any sign of mockery, of pity, of triumph. He found none. He saw only a quiet, steady resolve. The dam of his pride finally broke. His shoulders slumped, and he began to sob, deep, ragged breaths of a man who had lost everything and had just been handed an impossible sliver of hope. Jed just stood there, his hand resting on the weathered wood of the machine shed, and waited for his neighbor to cry himself out. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing. The community, humbled and reshaped by the crisis, found a new kind of wealth, one measured not in acres or bushels, but in resilience and cooperation. The nickname Scared Money Stone was never heard again. Instead, he was just Jed, a man whose quiet wisdom had become legendary. Younger farmers, the ones who had survived, would stop by his workshop not to mock his old equipment, but to ask his advice on how to fix a piece of machinery themselves, how to manage their books, how to know the difference between a calculated risk and a fool's gamble. Rich Miller, humbled and grateful, worked the 160 acres of his family's land as Jed's tenant. He farmed with a fierce determination, his old arrogance replaced by a quiet competence. He and Jed became unlikely friends, bonded by the shared earth and the memory of the storm they had weathered. 10 years later, on a sunny afternoon in Jed's kitchen, Rich slid a cashier's check across the old oak table and bought back his farm. Jed grew old. His hands, gnarled by a lifetime of work, became less steady, his back more stooped. But his mind remained sharp. His own son, David, had grown into a fine young man with his father's quiet nature and his grandfather's love for the soil. One crisp October afternoon, Jed stood leaning against the fender of his old Ford pickup, watching David work. The Massey Harris 90 Special, now a venerable antique, sat in the place of honor at the front of the machine shed, its faded red paint glowing in the late afternoon sun. It hadn't brought in a crop in years, but David kept it in perfect running order. David was teaching his own son, a boy of 10 named Samuel, how to change the oil on the old Lodestar grain truck. "See here, son," David was saying, pointing to the drain plug. "Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Grandpa Jed taught me that. He taught me that it's better to know how to fix something old than to have to pay for something new." Samuel looked over at his grandfather and smiled. Jed smiled back, a deep contentment settling over him. He looked past the machine shed, over the fields of corn stubble, golden in the setting sun. It was the same 400 acres his father had owned. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't the biggest farm in the county. But it was his. Every fence post, every bushel in the bin, every single black handful of earth was his, free and clear. He thought of Rich Miller's gleaming John Deere, now long gone, a ghost of a bygone era. Then he looked at his own combine, the Massey Harris 90, the machine they had all laughed at. It had outlasted the mockery, outlasted the boom, outlasted the bust. It stood now not as a symbol of fear or backwardness, but as a monument to a simple, powerful truth, that the strongest foundations are not built on debt and ambition, but on the solid ground of what a man can hold in his own two hands. The old combine was too slow, they'd said. It was too old. But it had been enough. It had always been enough.